Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey folks, back. This is your host, Pat Flynn. In today's episode, we are going to take a philosophical excursus into the worldview of atheism. And let me tell you, this, I think, is going to be very interesting. As many of you know, I had considered myself an atheist for many years, and it was actually my deep study of atheism that led me to realize this is just the silliest thing that a person could ever possibly believe. It cannot possibly be true. And yet, for whatever reason, atheism seems to be on the rise. And I've had many conversations lately with people who at least initially say that they are atheist. And what I have come to realize is that certainly, and here comes an anecdote, but at least in my experience of chatting with people of this sort, outside of the academy, is that they just really have no idea what atheism means, what atheism entails. They don't really get the atheistic worldview. What most of them are talking about when they say, as an atheist, they're really claiming to be an agnostic. I think that's the first thing we need to make clear. Because all that they've really established is that they lack a psychological belief in the person of God or anything divine. But that's just agnosticism. I'm not really that interested in a person's psychological state. People have weird psychological states all the time. What I'm interested in is truth. And classically, atheism is the positive claim that God does not exist. So here's where I want to go with this episode. I want you to be able to send this episode to your atheist friends, or somebody who has perhaps challenged you from the position of atheism. I'm going to provide, I think, a fairly sweeping critique of atheism, show that at bottom, the entire worldview is patently absurd. It is the silliest thing, and I'm not using hyperbole. And this, again, is coming from somebody who has devoted a very large chunk of his life to really studying atheism, reading the great atheistic philosophers, Nietzsche, Camus, Russell, Sartre, and then all the way to the contemporaries. There's not many great ones these days. Alex Rosenberg, I can think of. Looking at his book here, I'll be drawing on Alex Rosenberg's work throughout this. Wrote the Atheist's Guide to Reality. And so I think I can fairly say I get it. I understand atheism. And what I have realized is in dialoguing or debating with atheists, I have to do two things at once. One, I have to do two things at once. One, I have to show them why atheism is false. But two, I also have to teach them what atheism is. It's weird. And of course, this critique goes, on, it's fair to apply this to either side. There's many people who hold theistic worldviews who don't seem to understand the implications there either. So what I would like to do is explain what atheism is, explain what atheism entails, and then critique it. And again, I want to be open and charitable in my critique. When I say it's absurd, I'm not, I'm not, at least hoping that I'm not being condescending. I mean, quite literally, it reduces to absurdity, and we'll see what I mean by that when we get there. So the first thing to be clear on, definitionally, is that atheism is a positive claim. If you're gonna, and again, this will typically happen. Ask for some arguments. Okay, well, what arguments do you have, against God's existence? And they'll say, well, I don't have to give any arguments because I don't believe in God's existence. The burden of proof is on you. Again, there's more than just a slight significance here. Don't confuse atheism with agnosticism. Okay, one is about a person's psychological state. I might be agnostic about many things. I just maybe don't believe in them. They could be possible. Extraterrestrial life, for example. I'm agnostic about that. I'm open to the evidence. I'd say it seems quite improbable at this point. But, whatever. I could go one way or the other. That's agnostic. I'm not anti-extraterrestrial. I'm not saying that there absolutely is no extraterrestrial life. Then I would have to provide some type of argument for why I think that's the case. That's what atheism is saying. Atheism is saying there is no such person as God. There is no transcendent dimension to reality. And they'll say, and now the first thing they'll say is, well, how could, they'll be like, and you'll say, well, can you prove that? And they'll say, no, how could you possibly prove a negative? And then you got to catch them right away, because you actually can. And atheists, at least good atheists, have tried to disprove the existence of God, because all you have to do is show that the concept of God is incoherent to disprove it. For example, if you could show that there's some type of internal contradiction within the nature or character of God, that would show that we would have to abandon at least that conception of God, or admit that that particular God does not exist. So what does that mean? Well, it means if you could show that God is something like a round square, right? Like, what the heck is a round square? Well, it's nonsense. There's no such thing as a round square, or a four-sided triangle. And so on, or a married bachelor is the famous one that typically gets thrown around, right? So you just have to, I can prove that there's no such thing as a married bachelor, because once you get to understand the concepts, it's definitionally untrue. It's a contradiction in terms. It's just nonsense. So the project of many atheologians, as they're called, is to do just that, to try and attempt to show that there's some type of logical contradiction within the concept of God. And nobody has ever been able to successfully do that, not since the time of even the ancient Greeks. So it's a continuing project, but it is historically one of the most massively failed projects ever. But it's not impossible. So it's not unreasonable to ask somebody to prove or to show or ask what evidence they have, if they're an atheist, for why they don't think God exists. And there is a very classic example of this, by the way, that's called the problem of evil. If God is all powerful, he can create any world he wants. If God is all good, then he'll want his worlds to be free of suffering. But there is suffering in the world, so there's a contradiction here. God does not exist, is the claim. Now, the problem with that is it's just based off of premises that are unsound. So before I go on the offensive against atheism, I'll offer a slight defense here. One, when we say God is omnipotent, we say he's all-powerful, it doesn't mean he can create just any old world he wants. For example, God can't create nonsense. There's no nonsense with God. There's no possible world that God could create where a married bachelor exists, okay? Or where 2 + 2 = 7. All right, these are just meaningless assemblies of words and concepts. So same thing, God could not create a world where he forced people to freely act a certain way. Right? That's a contradiction. You can't force somebody to freely act a certain way. You either have free will or you don't. So it's not actually possible. And it's weird to think about that, because you think with God all things are possible. And that's true. All things are possible. A forced free act isn't a thing. It's nothing. It's nonsense. It doesn't mean anything. So you have to get the right concept of omnipotence. So it would not have been possible for God to create a world of free creatures whereby they always acted a certain particular way. So premise 1 is clearly false, and with that the argument comes down. But I would argue against premise 2 as well, that God, might very well have morally sufficient reasons for allowing suffering and evil to exist. And so long as that is even possible, which surely it is, then the second premise fails as well, and the entire argument is in total collapse. And why should we think that's? Well, we can all think of times in our lives where something bad happened, something maybe even truly catastrophic and terrible, where some greater good came of it eventually, or even if not in our lives, in somebody else's lives. And that's all we need to show that it is very well possible that some greater good could come out of any amount of suffering or evil in general. Now, we are not epistemically in a position to say what that is. And I think here we have to express intellectual humility, because people might say, well, why does, childhood cancer exist, or smog, or turtles choke on plastic rings in the ocean? And I agree, all those things are really bad. And the answer is, I don't know. I'm not omniscient. I'm just not in a good epistemic position to see. I think it's very important to understand that, our view of the world is so incredibly limited. It's like if you're looking at the Mona Lisa right next to it with a microscope, zoomed in on the tiniest little thread, and you're like, well, this doesn't make sense. I don't see any sort of piece of art here. God doesn't have that perspective, okay? God knows all things at all times. So he's seeing the entire tapestry, if you will. We don't. We have no idea. So it's okay to have that, humility and say, you know what, why this one thing happened, I have no idea. But I do know that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing any amount of evil and suffering to exist. And so long as that possibility is there, then that second premise is just unsound and the argument fails. So the reason I bring that up is that is a classic attempt, and it's something you often hear all the time in arguments of somebody trying to disprove the existence of God. So of course you can try and do that. Of course you can. And that is the task of the atheist. If they're going to make a claim, a positive claim about a negative status, which is still making a claim, they have a burden of proof. They have to be able to support that claim. By the way, I'm just having my coffee, just waking up still. So I hope that little rejoinder there was helpful, because I know a lot of people get pressed for the problem of evil. The funny, We'll get into the morality aspect in a minute, because what kind of undergirds that argument is a sense of right and wrong or moral value to begin with, and we'll see where atheism takes us with that. So I say that atheism is absurd, but in order to offer this critique, we have to get clear on what atheism is. I'm going to have another sip of my coffee here. Quick, forgive me. There's just like few things where you just know that God exists and loves you. Then one of those few things is just like that first sip of coffee in the morning. Okay, atheism. What is it? Well, atheism is again, it's a claim that no such person as God exists. There's no transcendent dimension to reality. So atheism really brings us to a worldview called metaphysical naturalism. And this is the part where, you got to really try to understand what the heck you're talking about, or what the heck your position is if you're going to call yourself an atheist. And metaphysical naturalism means that the easiest way to summarize it is that only physical things exist. Only physical things exist. Okay? Everything is reducible to fundamental particles, essentially. Okay? That's it. And I said I would be drawing off the work of Alex Rosenberg, who is a fairly prominent academic atheist these days. And I would go ahead and recommend his work because I think he's one of those people who is courageously consistent in his atheism. He understands it, he knows what it means, and he's able to follow through on all the conclusions. He's not like a Sam Harris, who is deeply inconsistent with his worldview. Rosenberg knows how to follow through on things. So I really do commend him for that. And his work is enjoyable to read, even though I think it's utterly absurd. So, and again, he wrote the book, The Atheist's Guide to Reality. And he was a professor or even head of the philosophy department at Duke for a while. I don't know if he's still there. So let that be known as we go through here before deciding where to send your children to school. So only physical things exist, right? So what can we conclude from that? What does that mean? Well, I think this is where somebody like Alex Rosenberg's work is really helpful. And I'm going to offer a critique of just about all of it, but note that I am not strawmanning the position at all. Everything I'm about to talk about is something that Professor Rosenberg absolutely affirms himself in his own book. These are his propositions. These are his positions on the way the world actually is from an atheistic, naturalistic worldview. And again, I think he's consistent, but I think it's by looking at his conclusions and seeing how absurd they are, we will see that this way of looking at the world, atheism, cannot possibly be true. And that's great. What a wonderful thing that is, to throw out such a garbage philosophy, because then we can start to search around a little bit more, look at the various theistic pantheistic or whatever, and try and make sense from that. And that's exactly what I did, by the way, in my own little path, my own little journey, is, as I studied atheism more and more, and I realized how absurd it was, it opened me up to hearing from the other side. And I will admit, I was kind of in an intellectual vacuum for a while, where I really just studied people who really were already in that camp, if you will. I just didn't care about the other philosophers, the theistic philosophers. But as atheism appeared more and more absurd, I started to open myself up to, people like Aristotle and Plato and Thomas Aquinas, and so on and so forth, and then contemporaries like Lonergan and Adler. And what I soon came to realize is, wow, these guys are just way better. They like, it's not even a comparison when comparing the atheistic and theistic philosophies. Their arguments are so much more rigorous and concise, and they just are able to make sense of the world in a way that everything that I've been reading for the past 10 years cannot. And so that kind of brought me into a general theism, and I spent some time, I would say, as a religious pluralist, which I think is probably the best offer on market, next to, my religion now, if I just be perfectly upfront. And religious pluralism essentially says, like, hey, all religions are false in a sense. We're not saying that atheism is true, but they're false in a sense. They're all kind of pointing toward the same thing, right? So I studied that a lot, and people like Aldous Huxley and his Perennial Philosophy is a good work on that. But then I studied the case for Christianity deeply, historically, philosophically, and realized, okay, actually, I'm not a religious pluralist anymore. And then I made that move. And then within Christianity, I surveyed all various countless denominations, not all of them, but I surveyed the big hinge point. Okay, all right, we have this kind of huge trunk of the tree, which is Catholicism, and then we have all these branches, which is Protestantism. And so I studied that deeply, the history of the church, the premises that Protestantism was based off of, sola scriptura, sola fide, so on and so forth, and concluded that those were just not accurate. They just could not be right. So that didn't sell me on Catholicism. Sell me, I'm using the wrong terminology here. I obviously believe now that this was all guided by the grace of God. But it kept me away from Protestantism, I would say. And then I was able to look at Catholicism seriously, historically, read the great Catholic thinkers and writers. And then, it got me. It absolutely did get me. I realized all my prejudice, which I had against the Catholic Church, which was about every prejudice a person could possibly hold, every stereotype. If you would have told me, I know I always say this, if you had told me, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I would have been a Catholic, I would have died of a petrified diaphragm from laughing so hard. It's just, I just would not have believed you. Yet here we are. So that's a summary of my journey, but it very much did start from a many years study of atheism and understanding it. So metaphysical naturalism. I was seeing the absurdities of this worldview that eventually brought me out of it. So only physical things exist. Okay, what does somebody like Rosenberg conclude from that? I'll go through a few points, and we'll just have some fun with this. Number one, because only physical things exist, Rosenberg concludes that there can be no intentional states of consciousness, meaning we can never think about anything. Because he says, well, how could one physical thing be about anything else? So an intentional state means that something is about something, or something is of something else. So right now, I'm thinking about Alex Rosenberg's book, The Atheist Guide to Reality. That's an intentional state of consciousness. But Alex Rosenberg says, since only physical things exist, that makes no sense. Okay. But, I'm thinking about Alex Rosenberg's book where he calls that an illusion. That is an intentional state of consciousness. Therefore, metaphysical naturalism must be false, right? So this is what I mean when I say it's absurd. It literally reduces to absurdities. That's just one point, right? So if you think that you ever think about anything, if you think that you're thinking about this conversation, you should not be an atheist. You should reject atheism. That's one point. It gets better. Alex Rosenberg also tellingly admits that because there's no intentional state, since we can't ever think about anything, that sentences have no meaning. There just is no meaning. And he even says in his book, actually, that all the sentences in his book have no meaning, which makes you wonder why the heck he ever bothered writing it to begin with. It is very peculiar. And you think I'm being facetious or trying to set up a straw man. I am not. I very much encourage you to get the book, and Rosenberg is a serious philosopher. I mean, I don't take his position seriously, but he is a serious philosopher. I think he does think consistently. He's well published. He's well known. This is not. I'm not trying to pick the weakest version of. I'm trying to pick the strongest version of atheism to critique. So he says that there can be no meaning because there's no intentional states of consciousness, but that's clearly absurd because you understand what he's saying. You understand what I'm saying. You get it. There is meaning. Therefore, we should conclude that metaphysical naturalism, again, is absurd. Now, from this, he also concludes consistently, though I would say wrongly, that there's just no such thing as truth. There's no intentional states of consciousness. We can't think about things. There's no meaning in sentences. Therefore, there's really no way to detect that anything is true. Now, this one is utterly peculiar because, one, obviously, we can know truth. We can know that I exist, that you exist. It's the most basic truth that we know, that 2 + 2 = 4, so on and so forth. So if you think that you could ever know the truth about anything, you should not be an atheist. But furthermore, if we can never know truth, then why is he trying to argue that atheism is true? So it's not only incoherent, but it's a performance contradiction, where he says one thing, but it constantly goes against everything else that he does. Okay, moving along, the absurdity. So keep this in mind. If anybody ever says that it's silly to believe in God, just keep these points in mind as we move along. You tell me what you think is sillier. Okay, morality. So here again, I commend Rosenberg for being absolutely consistent. If only physical things exist, morality cannot be distilled in a test tube. Morality isn't something we can detect through scientific instruments. So he is a full-on moral nihilist. He says that all morality is an illusion. There is no such thing as right or wrong, good or bad, or evil. And therefore, people think that there is even just one thing in this world that is truly right, or one thing in this world that is truly wrong, whether that is torturing young children or genocide. If you just think any of those things is objectively wrong, and when I say objectively, I mean wrong independent of human opinion, then you should not be an atheist. You should reject metaphysical naturalism. And here I have to really lavish some skeptical praise on Rosenberg, because I think this is a dangerous and obscene position. But he's consistent. He's willing to go all the way with his nihilism. Furthermore, if you think that you've ever done anything or know anybody who's done anything that they really are deserving praise or blame for their behavior, you should reject atheism. You should not be an atheist. So this is where Rosenberg is in contrast with somebody like Sam Harris, who, Sam tries to hold on to objective morality as an atheist, but Sam tries to hold on to objective morality as an atheist, but you can't do that. There's no way to ground it. Rosenberg understands this, so he is willing to go all the way. This is why I like Rosenberg. He's consistent. He understands his worldview. The vast majority of atheists, whether, kind of your typical village atheist, the shrill, petulant, quivering, shrieking atheists in YouTube comments, to even more popular level atheists, there's so much inconsistency. They're just not willing to follow through logically to the ends, to the conclusions. Nietzsche was. Rosenberg is. So that, I would only ask of the atheist what I ask of myself and everybody else: consistency with your worldview. And that's why I'm working off of Alex Rosenberg, because I really do think that he gets it. And again, it's by studying people like him and others where I said, this is correct if atheism is true. This would have to be metaphysical naturalism follows from atheism, and then everything else that we're talking about would have to follow from that metaphysical perspective. This is just what the case would have to be. But then you keep pushing to the conclusions, you realize that every single one of them is utterly absurd, that you then should probably go back and figure out if maybe you got that initial premise wrong. Maybe it wasn't atheism. Maybe it was theism. So let's continue, because it gets better. So far, on atheism, we've seen that we can make no sense of mental states, of intentional states of consciousness, that there is no meaning, that we have no way of detecting truth, which is very peculiar because Rosenberg is also he's a proponent of scientism. He thinks that the only way to get any knowledge is epistemological naturalism, which is different than metaphysical naturalism, meaning only through the natural sciences can we gain knowledge. Yet at the same time, this leads him to conclude that we can really have no justified true belief about anything. So it's just this weird contradiction again. Morality is an illusion. Let's just do like one or two more. I can't remember absolutely everything from his book. I did do a brief skim through the other night just to refresh myself. But here's another good one. So Rosenberg says that since only physical things exist, there are no enduring selves. Meaning that you and me are not the same person as we were when we started this conversation, right? So if all we are is a collection of molecules. These molecules are constantly in flux. So we are technically, physically, not the same person that we were when we started this conversation. There can be no enduring selves for any two moments of time. So I will simply say this. If you think that you are actually the same person now as you were when we began this conversation, you should not be an atheist. You should reject metaphysical naturalism. And of course, as theism, we have ways to substantiate enduring selves. We have the existence of a soul, of a configuring principle. We have a form to the matter. So it's not hard to explain. By the way, everything that's reducing to absurdity on atheism has a great explanation on theism of God's existence, and maybe we can go back and work through some of those after this critique is done. And then let's finish with this one, which is like I think the best part of it all, and that is, as Rosenberg will say, there just are no selves to begin with. There just are no persons to begin with. The self is an illusion, since we cannot reduce consciousness to physical processes. Rosenberg is an eliminativist, which means that since it cannot be explained on metaphysical naturalism, it must be sort of waved away. We have to conclude that it exists. Now, if you get to this point after everything else and you're still an atheist, I don't know how to help you. I just don't know what to do or what to say. If you are willing to think that belief in God, for whatever reason, is more difficult than believing that you do not exist, I don't know what else to say. I mean, of course we exist. Of course I exist. Of course you exist. That is the one thing you cannot deny. You can't deny it. Because as soon as you deny that you exist, there has to be someone to do the denying and someone else to believe the denial. So you can't deny it without reaffirming it. Furthermore, even if you say the self is an illusion, there has to be someone who's having that illusion. You cannot get around this. And furthermore, if there's someone who's having that illusion, they're having an intentional state of consciousness about that illusion. So it goes back and refutes his first claim as well. This folks' consciousness about that illusion. So it goes back and refutes his first claim as well. This, folks, I'm telling you, this is what really thank God. Thank God it was my serious study of atheism, because it was by studying this worldview all the way through as much as I could that led me out of it. And I hope that you can see at this point, I'm not being facetious when I say that this cannot possibly be true. This is the most absurd perspective a person could ever hold. We have lost everything and explained essentially nothing. The best explanation we can do is wave away all those things that are most fundamental and basic to our existence. The fact that we can think about things, that we understand things, that we can know truth, that there is some objective right and wrong dimension of reality, that we are the same person as we were 2 minutes ago, 5 minutes ago, 5 years ago, and that we exist to begin with. These things cannot be explained on metaphysical naturalism. So we kind of have a reverse argument for God, for the existence of God, by just showing, because look, here's the truth. If metaphysical naturalism is false, right, there's only one alternative. It has to be some type of supernaturalism. And so you have naturalism and you have supernaturalism. One says that only physical things exist. The other allows for some type of transcendent dimension of reality. Now, by showing that metaphysical naturalism or atheism is false, that doesn't show that the Christian religion is true. It doesn't show that any one particular religion is true, but at least opens up the door for some potential religion being true. And then you can just switch your investigation, and you should switch your investigation. That's a different question. All we're trying to do right now is just see which of these generally is true. We have atheism, we have theism. Now, if you follow me along for any of those points and you think, yes, Pat, those are the most absurd conclusions that I have ever heard. That is the silliest thing I've ever heard. That I'm with you. I sympathize you. And you should reject atheism outright. It cannot be true. It cannot be right. And this is wholly independent of arguments for God's existence, which I think there are many sound arguments for God's existence. I mean, talk about the contingency argument or the cosmological argument. How could any series of contingent things rest without some type of necessary reality? Arguments from objective moral values. If you really do think there is some right things or wrong things in this world, well, ultimately you're going to have to ground that in something beyond nature. Arguments from intelligibility, the applicability of mathematics, arguments from teleology or the immense fine-tuning of the universe. By the way, the fine-tuning of the universe, what an exquisite study that is. And that's a really helpful thing to understand, because that just puts the whole evolution debate off the table, right? So if constants and quantities of the Big Bang, which clearly there is. I mean, it is so precisely dialed in for the emergence of intelligent life right at the beginning of the universe that the question of evolution really becomes irrelevant, because we're looking at design at those starting conditions, and then we can be open to whatever evidence evolution gives us after that. But I mean, if you haven't looked into the fine tuning of the universe, look into there's many great cosmologists who do work on this. Hugh Ross is a good one. He kind of specializes in it. Take a look at Hugh Ross, or even beyond the fine tuning of it, just the origin, the classic Kalam cosmological argument. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. The universe has a cause. Therefore, what type of thing could cause the universe? Well, the universe is just all of space, matter, time, and energy. So whatever that thing is, it must be beyond space, matter, time, and energy. It must be immaterial, extremely powerful, a personal agent, and we can sort of deduce what these various divine attributes would be and realize, this is just what we know to be God. And as a Christian, I would say there's really good, strong historical evidence for the resurrection of Christ as well, which can only be explained on a supernatural worldview. You cannot make sense of that with naturalism. You have to resort to a whole bunch of kind of weird hypotheses like group hallucinations or conspiracy theories or whatever. So the point I'm making is that there's not only, I would say there's probably about 20 or so really strong arguments for the existence of God, wholly independent, that at least that I've studied. There might be more. Wholly independent of the reductions to absurdity of atheism. Then when you combine these two things, and then when you when you solve the problem of evil, which tends to be, the major holdup for most people, when you show that the problem of evil just really isn't a good argument, then to me, the preponderance of evidence is so far on one side that you just have no excuse. You have no excuse for being an atheist anymore. It's intellectually bankrupt. It is not a position that I think can be taken seriously when seriously studied. The problem is most people don't seriously study it. They see they hear one objection like, do you believe in the flying spaghetti monster or something, and they just never look, and they think that that's somehow a good objection. It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I never even, at least when I consider myself an atheist, I didn't believe stupid things like that, right? So what's wrong with the flying spaghetti monster? Well, first off, he's a material being, supposedly, right? He's in time, space. Well, we've just said that whatever created the universe cannot be a material being or time and space. So we eliminate all the attributes that would be something like a flying noodle ball just by understanding natural theology and philosophy and seeing, well, what type of necessary reality could be the ultimate ex-nihilator of the universe? It could not be anything physical, material, so on and so forth. So it couldn't be space aliens. It couldn't be a man in the sky with a beard. It couldn't be a flying spaghetti monster. The problem is people just don't think about these things, not seriously. So you have these sort of fundy atheist objections, which honestly, nobody does take them seriously above the level of YouTube comments. But it's like in fitness, too, where there's these kind of common myths that are just really annoying to professionals that constantly persist. You constantly keep hearing them. You constantly have to keep smacking them down. They're vampire myths, right? It doesn't matter how many times you kill them. They keep coming back. But the point I'm making is when you take this stuff seriously, when you take philosophy seriously, you realize the position of atheism is a total non-starter. When you really understand it, it just cannot possibly be true. It can make virtually no sense of the most fundamental and basic aspects of our existence, and it makes utter nonsense out of even more than that. Whereas you weigh the arguments and evidence for theism, the scale tips entirely to one side. I'm not saying that there's no good arguments against any particular religious worldview. There are. I think that the problem of evil is a good, if not an intellectual obstacle, it's a significant emotional obstacle, and it was for me. I would say this is the one thing that kind of pulled me away from faith in my youth, was being confronted with that. So I don't want to seem too casually dismissive of suffering and evil. I mean, it hurts me and it affects me as much as anybody. But I'm trying to get at this philosophically, intellectually, and when you can solve the problem logically, then it doesn't need to be a holdup anymore to theism or God, and then you can figure out, how do I solve this emotionally? And that's the job of the pastor, the counselor, the teacher, so on and so forth. That's the job of theodicy. So once you accept that God exists, then you can start to dig into various reasons of, okay, what could some of these morally sufficient reasons for eviling and suffering exist be? And for me, the Christian religion answered that better than anything else, because it affirmed objective right and wrong. It didn't try to take a dualistic stance and say that good and evil are just two sides of the same coin. That's obviously false. I mean, if you think that it's like, the abuse of little children is morally indifferent, it's just seeing things from a different perspective. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help you. The only question there is, what level of punishment does that person deserve who does such a thing? So here's what I want you to do. I don't expect everybody listening this to memorize everything I've just gone through, but if you have that atheist friend or uncle or parent or child or whatever, send them this episode. Send this episode to your atheist friend, and let them hear it and let them stew on it, because I get that a lot. So many people email me because of these Sunday school episodes, and they say, Pat, I was talking to my friend who says he's an atheist, and he says that he thinks that belief in God or whatever is irrational, and I don't know how to respond. Send them this episode, and hopefully this will be a useful tool for you to show that, no, actually, belief in God, at least theism generally, we haven't gone into any particular religion, is the far, far more rational position to hold. Far more rational position to hold than atheism. And I'll even take it one step further, is that, and Rosenberg admits this, part of the reason he admits that there's no meaning or truth is because he gets this implication. But if God exists, right, if we work off that conditional, then we have at least reasonable assurance that God wanted our faculties to be reliable, right? He would want them more generally aimed at truth than not. So we have reason to be able to trust that reasoning is aimed at truth, and that the world outside our head actually exists. It's not a massive hallucination, right? We can kind of take the reliability of our faculties on a bundled deal. And I would say, even more particularly from the Christian perspective, we have really great assurance that our faculties would be reliable, and that we can know truth, and that we do have rationality. But if atheism is true, we don't really have any reason to believe that our faculties are reliable. Because there's no reason that on a metaphysical naturalist worldview, a world with no design, where everything is shaped through selection and mutation, that reasoning is aimed at truth. There's no reason to think that since all of our beliefs are formed that same way, again through the Darwinian process, that we're not riddled with false but useful beliefs. In fact, that's what atheists claim about morality and God and so on, that these were just false beliefs that happen to be useful for survival. But the problem is, as soon as you admit that, there's really no way to tell which of our beliefs are true. and which of our beliefs are false. Because if selection can push through false but useful beliefs in this part, in this area of the brain, there's no reason it can't push it through in all areas of the brain. So you actually lose rationality to begin with. You lose the grounds for justified true belief epistemologically when starting from the premise of atheism. So what does this get at? Well, it gets at a famous argument made by Alvin Plantinga in his book Warranted Christian Belief, where he says, look, belief in God is proper and basic. If we have reason to think that our faculties are generally aimed at truth, it's sort of a bundled deal, right? There's no more reason to deny our sense of the divine, which pretty much everybody has, right? We all come into this world with a natural religion, with a sort of dualistic mindset that things are designed. That is something you need to be conditioned out of. It's like morality, right? We all have these sort of basic beliefs. Again, it doesn't mean you come into the view of the world particularly believing in one specific religion, but we all come in with we call it a theistic point of view, of a basic sensus divinitatis, as Calvin called it, or as Thomas Aquinas would say, a general and confused knowledge of God. That is a basic belief to us. And again, there's no reason to deny the reliability of that faculty over any other faculty unless you're assuming the position of atheism. But if you're assuming the position of atheism, then you should deny the reliability of all your faculties, as Rosenberg regularly concludes. You just really can't know the truth about anything. You've lost rationality. You've lost justified true belief. You've really put yourself into a self-perpetuating snare of skepticism. You can't make sense out of anything. And you might think, well, I'll just be skeptical about everything. But that doesn't work, because then you should be skeptical about your skepticism. Skepticism is a belief, but we've just said that we don't know of any beliefs or how any beliefs would be true in atheism, which would include skepticism. So you just get in this infinitely vicious loop of self-perpetuating doubt. It really is utterly absurd. Look, God's no dummy. He knew when he set up the world that you would never be able to reason against him any more than a stream can rise higher than its source. God is the source of all reason. You're not going to be able to out-reason or out-logic God. So you can use theism and God as a sort of good measuring stick in a way, to the extent that you're thinking well, that you're seeking truth. That truth will lead to God. Maybe not right away, but eventually, if you keep digging, you keep studying, it's going to get you there. So this episode has been requested numerous times for me to give a critique on atheism, and I hope that this was at least interesting. Many friends that I have to say I've been successful in pulling a lot of people out of their atheism after having these conversations and just kind of laying out, okay, like if atheism is true, then these things would also have to be true. And by getting people to better understand what the atheistic picture really is, I think is one of the best way to help people conclude that it's just not true. I've often found that that's more useful. Rather than arguing for God, I just want to argue deeper into atheism. And then you're either going to have to live in a world of absurdity, or you can take a step back and you can say, you know what, and this is exactly what happened to me. This cannot possibly be true. This is not the way the world is. This is crazy. Let me now go and consider the other side. Let me consider theism or supernaturalism. So send this episode to anybody who you think it might be helpful for. I will continue this series. I'm happy to go into any one of these. I know we kind of did a sort of fairly brief overview of each of these positions. I'm happy to go into any one of them a little bit deeper. As we move forward, I'm going to go more into the arguments for God in general, because that can help us refine the concept of God. And it can help us to know, there's a lot we can know about God through deep armchair thinking alone without relying on revelation or anything like that. And I think that's a really useful project. I had Josh Rasmussen on, who got his PhD in analytic metaphysics not too long ago, where we talked about the argument from contingency. So if you didn't listen to that, really good starting point there, and I'll be developing more of those over time. So again, hope this was useful. Hope it was interesting, and I hope you know some people that maybe you can recommend this episode to. And if you are listening to this episode for the first time, if somebody did recommend it to you, hi, hello, welcome to the podcast. And I want to let you know that I get it. I've been there. My criticism and perhaps opened some minds to considering things from another angle. So thanks for tuning in, folks. This is Pat Flynn, and please do subscribe, share, so on and so forth. Talk soon. Subscribe, share, so on and so forth. Talk soon.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.